Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karabhavahai
Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
The seventh chapter of the Chandogya Upanishad opens with a story, a dialogue between the highly erudite sage Narada and the teacher in this context. Who is that? Sanat Kumara. Sanat Kumara is one of the teachers that was directly taught by Lord Dakshinamurti, and we see that there Dakshinamurti has 4 sages there who are wearing ash on their bodies. Do you see in the photo? Which one is Sanat Kumara? You can choose anyone you want. Yeah. So, Narada, Narada is not an ordinary person. Please understand. It's not just some roadside, fellow. Narada was so respected. He knew all the Vedas. He knew what is called the Angas, the limbs of the Veda, so to speak. Prosody, all these things. Pronunciation, prosody, grammar, astrology, astronomy. Plus he knew what are called the Upavedas. Upavedas means offshoots of the Vedas. Upa means near. So things that sit near to the Veda, like Ayurveda, Dhanurveda, Dhanurvidya, archery, and Nakshatra Vidya, astrology, astronomy, Shastra Vidya, the knowledge of weapons, all this he knew. Highly erudite. He knew all the 4 Vedas. He was a Chaturvedi. So that's the last name in India. He knew all the 4 Vedas and he was highly erudite. Plus he had what's that? He had a free lifelong visa to go from one loka to another loka. Otherwise we are all loka bound. What is loka?
Place.
A place that makes you loco. That is called loka. New definition. Loka means your world, this universe in a certain sense, but more your world, in which the world of interactions with humans and other animals, cows, etc., that we have. This is called loka. Now, we have, after this Harry Potter, I'm so happy because now we have the concept of parallel universes. I don't have to explain. So there is the world of ancestors at the same time happening, unfolding in present time. There's the world of angels, celestials. First there are the lower rung celestials that bring chai to the upper rung celestials. And then there are, other celestials in charge of other celestials. All these things we can imagine. They're not necessary, but they are fun to imagine. Unfolding in quote unquote this everyday time. So they are parallel universes. And the Veda talks about 14 such lokas. 7 up, 7 down. Yeah. 7 up means as good as this earth or better, best. Those are not their names, but just for now. And then 7 down means less comfortable than this plane, less, and worst being Patala, like this. So we have all these range of delightful and not so delightful lokas to inhabit. So if you are in one loka, you cannot go to the other loka, correct? Absolutely not, because an object can only occupy one place at one time. One is bound by object-wise, time-wise, space-wise. So if you are in this form, in this particular body right now, it's not easy or it's impossible to go to another loka in the same body or even in a different body. It's difficult. Maybe there are some sensitives who can do this, but we are talking of everyday normal people. We are not talking of people with siddhis. So how can you go to the other loka after you give up this body? Then you go to the other loka, correct? Not before that. But Narada had a free pass. He would go to all the lokas in the same body. And he was well known. He was one of those very highly, sensitive and developed, evolved, here I can use the word soul, evolved soul, that could that transcended all lokas, that could go to the lokas. And there are stories that he would go to Indra Loka, where Indra, the ruler of heaven, resides. And he would say, "You are the best, east or west." And he would go to Surya Loka, where the sun resides. And he would say to them, "What? You are the best, east or west." There, of course, it's more pertinent because the sun goes from east to west, supposedly. But like this, he kept everybody all the rulers of the lokas in good books. He never ticked anybody off, very pleasant, very knowledgeable. And then, one day, he understood that despite gaining all this knowledge, there was a thorn on his side. What was the thorn? Sorrow was his thorn. It was a secret thorn. Because when you become so famous, you're traversing lokas. And then you're also taking Prozac. Come on, what's wrong with you? You are so erudite, you know everything, everybody is coming to you, you have become very famous, you are knowledgeable, you have a presence in the world. If you Google Narada, lots of hits will come. You see how he is so famous? He is on Google. So you see, he has a presence, and with the presence, with fame, comes also an identification with that. So what happens? You are too famous to seek a teacher, to remove the thorn on the side, get help with removing the thorn on the side. You certainly can't be seen sitting in a Vedanta class. Because what will other people think? The other people sitting around me will think I don't know, that's why I'm here. Oh no, I'm beyond all this. Of course, he could have been a fly on the ancient mud wall of Sanat Kumara's class, because he could go into various bodies and all that. But he decides to approach it directly, because the approaching the teacher is very important and is eulogized in every Upanishad. So he doesn't use any covert means, although he could have become, he had many invisible cloaks of different colors that he could wear, which made him look very good, and he could wear and sit in the class. He could have done all those things. He had, clairaudience. He could have just eavesdropped on the class without even being there. No, he decides to take the direct approach. But still uncomfortable to sit in the class. After the last prayer is said and all the students disperse, he comes to Sanat Kumara slowly, carefully, and whispers, Bhagavaha, same Bhagavaha here. Hey Bhagavan, Soham, I am this fellow who is seeking this knowledge. Shochami, I am subject to grief. From Shuch to grief. I'm subject to Shoka, grief. And then, Sanat Kumara says, all right, I will teach you, but I have to know whether to start at Vedanta 101 or 201, because you are very erudite, you must be knowing a lot already, or 301. Tell me what you know and I will restructure your teaching accordingly. And the whole page is Narada's listing of everything he knows. He says Rig Vedaha, Yajur Vedaha, Sama Vedaha, Atharva Vedaha, Shiksha, Kalpo, Vyakaranam, Niruktam, Chandasam, Jyotisham, Iti. What branch of knowledge is Iti? Iti means what? Which branch of knowledge is Iti? Huh? Huh?
ETC.
ETC? No, what is Iti? So he said thus. That's a quotation mark. Don't think that is also one more branch of knowledge. Then he takes a breath and then he says, Dhanur Vidya, Nakshatra Vidya, Shastra Vidya, Ayurveda, let me take your pulse, and all these things. He just goes on and on and on and on. And of course, with enlisting of each branch of knowledge, he sits up a little straighter. The shoulders go like this, and looks around in the hope that some few stragglers are listening to his, Sahasranama of himself. What is Sahasranama? 1001 names said in the praise of Bhagavan, but he has so many 1001 qualifications. He is so happy to list them all. And Sanat Kumara, the teacher, reacts very strangely. He throws his head back and laughs. He says, here I am telling you I am sad and you are laughing. What kind of a teacher are you? He could have said, but doesn't. He waits for the teacher to stop laughing, to explain himself. He says, you know so much. You know a lot, O Narada. You know a lot of nothing. How much is a lot of nothing? If you know a little bit of nothing, how much do you know? Nothing. So he says, all that you know is nothing, because the thing that makes all these nothings into that thing, gives it a being. You don't know that thing which sustains all these nothings. If you don't know that thing, you don't know anything. And then he says, Alpameva. Alpa means small, tiny bit. That which is encapsulated in your brain, in your tiny little brain, is a tiny amount of knowledge. Alpameva tava jnanam. Your knowledge is tiny. And then he says, Yad alpam tan martyam. That which is small, tiny, is subject. What do I mean by tiny? Is martyam, finite, subject to death. That is what my definition of tiny is. Tiny doesn't mean small size-wise. Tiny means that which comes to an end, which is a dead end, that leaves you deadened and makes you keep pursuing all these dead ends, red herrings, infinitely. So if you pursue the finite infinitely, you are a lost cause. That's what you have done, O Narada, for half your life. You have pursued the finite infinitely. The pursuit of the finite is an infinite quest. And when the quest becomes infinite, one's thirst is never quenched. One is always helpless, hopeless, hapless, always searching, yearning, longing without a sense of belonging. This is the problem. If the longing leads to belonging, okay, theek hai, wonderful. But if there is only longing, and there is no be, the be stands for the being, there is no being in the longing. You cannot make a religion out of the longing. You cannot make a way of life out of the longing, even though people do. Sometimes people sit and sing sad songs, and they call it sad sang, They sat and they sang. Darshan kab doge? When will you give me darshan, oh Lord? Where are you? Why are you playing hide and go seek? Why are you doing this? There is some venting, some, feeling of niceness comes because other people also are crying with you, so that feels, okay, I'm not mad, that other people are also sad makes me not mad, and so we'll have sad sang, and we'll just sing sad songs. But then after you leave the thing, that sadness one still carries. You can't keep fueling that sadness. That sadness has to have an opening. That sadness has to have a remedy. Why? Because it is non-acceptable to me. If I was happy being sad, if everybody was happy being sad, we would not be having this conversation. But nobody is happy being sad. Unless they are also deluded. Sad and deluded, okay. But nobody is happy being sad. In fact, one wants to get rid of the sadness, just like Narada. He knows so much. He has so many contacts. He can just think of somebody and they appear. He has so many magical powers. He has so many miracles. He has so many, qualifications. But the thorn on the side hasn't gone. Why? Because that original problem of the insecurity and the fear centered on a sense of lack on oneself has not been interrogated, has not been understood, has not been addressed adequately. It's like putting using pursuits and actions to address it is like putting a band-aid on the Grand Canyon. What will happen? Nothing. You have to address it, and you have to acknowledge it and address it. So therefore, it is no fun to pursue something, pursue the finite infinitely. And this is what is called the cycle of samsara. This life, what did I do? Pursued the finite, pursued the finite, pursued the finite, pursued the finite, got out of breath, died. Then next life, pant, gasp, died. And then next life, pursued the finite, pursued more finite, mistook the finite for being fine, and then kept, fine, finite, oh, not so fine, died a sad, first death, out of breath death, next death, sad death. By the third life, one is a mad, because like, where is this? What is this? Pursue, samsara, some sorrow, some total of my sorrow, mad, angry, died an angry death. Then fourth life, sad, because after mad comes sad, that is called the 6 stages of all this, this recovery. So after mad comes definitely sad. So sad life, sad pursuits, sad marriages, plural. And, sad children, sad. So why sad children? Because if there are sad parents, what else will they be? Not genetic, socialized. Yeah. Sad children, sad pursuits, sadly went to the sad job and sadly came back, sadly purchased a house, sadly lived in it, sad, died a sad death, samsara, some sorrow, next life. So we have covered mad, sad, and then next time the person becomes a rebel, rad. So rad life, everything I don't want, everything in a mode of rebellion, nothing works, I'm an anarchist, and all these things, and then what? Died. And then that's what it is, whether you are sad, mad, rad, bad, you are pursuing the finite infinitely. And we can say this because we have this whole concept of reincarnation. And the concept of reincarnation is meant only for this purpose. It's a model to understand how the finite can be kept on stretched like a sad little elastic band. You keep stretching the finite to produce the infinite. The infinite is not a product. It is you. It is uncreated. And for that I have to change the channel of this remote brain. Somewhere it has gone to graze on some alpha. I have to change the channel on this brain and see the connection between what I am pursuing and what I am getting. And so basically the answer is in the non-pursuit, not in the pursuit. Because the pursuit is only giving me disappointments, anger, fear. It's only fueling what was already there. So what is a non-pursuit? A non-pursuit is understanding that the problem is centered on the I, therefore the solution is also centered on this I. Perhaps I have misperceived the problem, and therefore I have to look for something that will address this problem, not through action. Because action and moksha are like oil and water. Not even in a salad dressing do they mix gracefully. Action is antithetical to this pursuit because the problem is one of self-ignorance. I don't know my own glory. I don't know my own fulfillment. I don't know my own mahima. Mahima means greatness. And therefore I grieve. So you see the connection between grieving and the self is that the grieving is not happening because I'm not getting what I want. The grieving is happening because I'm not recognizing what I have is what I already want. What I already want is it's a siddha vastu, established fact, which has to be discovered rather than sadhya vastu, something to be gained in time and in place, also to be lost in time and its place. This is the problem. This is the fundamental problem, is that the pursuit is not understood. And therefore we keep thinking, maybe I can get it this way, maybe I can get it that way. Why do we have to be so fanatical and say that, oh, only through knowledge this will be, relieved? Nothing fanatical about it. I told you, in order to see something like a form, you need eyes to see form and color. What is fanatical about it? No, can I please see it in some other way? Why? Why? You examine the head to find out why you want to see it another way when there is a direct way, God-given way to see it. No, can I see it through the pores? The skin is also an organ of knowledge. So maybe the flower, let's illustrate. Maybe the flower, this one is attached to its job. It would not let me pick another one. It said, no, I did this yesterday, I'm going to do this today also. So, if I do this, or if I go back and forth like this, I'm going to sense the flower, but not its form and color. I will have the touch of Ishvara. When you touch this, this is not something you can mimic. You can make an artificial silk flower, it can look exactly like this, you can spray some scent, it can smell exactly like this, but the touch is the delineating factor to tell when the eyes can't tell. But really speaking, this is not the primary way to see form and color, correct? Oh, what a nice color. And then when I look, I say, oh, so soft it is. The softness is not discerned by the eyes. This is the meaning of the word pramana. Pramana means the means of knowledge, appropriate to uncover that which is to be known, and that which is to be known cannot be altered just because the means of knowledge is telling something. No. The means of knowledge reveal what is to be revealed exactly as it is. And this should be a matter of great relief, because the means of knowledge for understanding one's own glory as this total being, this conscious, limitless, whole, non-complaining, non-querulous being, non-wanting, non-desirous, compassionate and complete person, to us, that the means of knowledge to see that is the words of the Upanishad, handled by someone who can handle the means of the knowledge, who himself has been taught. There is the safety. Who himself has been properly taught. So by a qualified person who is able to unfold this so that you can see. Just like the person sees, the person is able to make you see that there has to be a shift in this seeing, in this knowing, in the way we see it. That is what it is. There is nothing fanatic about it. And when I say Upanishad, we are not just talking of how many ever there are here. We are talking of any body of knowledge, anywhere in the world that can teach just like what this shows. That is called Vedanta. Like I said yesterday, India is privileged because we have kept that teaching tradition alive in a way that has not been the privilege of many other, indigenous systems of knowledge. So therefore, this is what we know. We know the teaching tradition and we know that it works. Why? Because you are here. I am here. So therefore, going back to the story, he says, Yad alpam tan martyam. Tat martyam. Martyam means whatever all this is small. That which I call small, what I mean by small, he explains, is not size-wise, but in terms of finitude. This is small. Small means subject to coming to an end. But that's not what one wants. I want to be happy. How long? 5 minutes? No, 6, 10. Okay, have a whole day. No. I want to be happy forever. And even the person on the 8th marriage, in the marriage vow will say this is for ever. It's very clear, they don't want the marriage, they want the forever, for which they are using the marriage as a means, which the marriage is not a means forever. Neither the children are a means forever. Neither are your possessions a means forever. What you want is forever, and that forever, Ananta, is called from the standpoint of the individual pursuit, Ananda, happiness. What you want is forever. And if you don't know that, this is just classic psychological transference. You transfer the basis for this forever on all things finite. In the finite, you look for the infinite. It's easier to look for the needle inside the haystack. You will find it. This you will not find because it's not there. This is what it is. There is a mistaken perception, and the mistake has to be corrected through knowledge because the perception is mistaken. Yadalpam tad martyam. That which is small is equal to finite. Yad martyam, he continues, that which is subject to being finite, tat na bhuma. He introduces a new word for Atma. Bhuma. You know? And the word is bhuman, like Atman. Bhuma, bhumano, bhumanah. And so he introduces a new word, bhuma, for the infinite. You can call it anything, it doesn't matter. Because it's not about the name, it's about you. Then why did the teacher Sanat Kumara introduce a new word? He introduced the new word because, especially when teaching, we learn from teachers how to teach. And the teacher in the Upanishad uses a new word previously unheard because he is teaching Narada, who knows all the words in the Vedas. He knows Atma, 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 Brahman, Brahman. He's taken it for granted because he's sad. The depressed person, the person subject to sorrow, is also very jaded and faded. And and you say Atma, there is no spark being lit in the person. Bhuma, oh, something new to know. I don't know Bhuma. What Bhuma? Bhuma? I've learnt all the 4 Vedas, it never comes. What is this Bhuma? It's an attention getting mechanism on part of the teacher. Makes him sit up. Otherwise he can use anything. He can use Atma, he can use Sat, Chit, Ananda, Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. Been there, done that, been there, done that. That is the feeling Narada has. He's jaded, he's learnt it all, he knows. Everything is just words, words, words. In Hamlet, the play, he says that. What are you reading? Words, 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 he tells. He tells Polonius that. So, therefore what? A new word is introduced to teach that which is both ancient and new at the same time. Ever new, ever discovered, ever now, ever new, but also which is uncreated, which always was, always is, always will be in an unchanging way. That is what I want to know, to feel. That is what I have to know to feel this security, to get rid of the depression, the sorrow, the anger, the mad, bad, rad, situations. This is what I need. I need this knowledge. So the second Paravidya, the must associated with that, is a very big must, is a different must than the first must, and you must see that. Do you see the difference? The first must is an on the way must, is a preparatory must. It's a must to know the other one. The second must is an absolute must. So the first must which goes with a relative knowledge is a relative must, which, which is for the sake of gaining the absolute must. Because why should I gain this knowledge? Why must I gain this para knowledge? This knowledge called para, why I have to gain? The reason is that is the only lasting antidote to all your quest. Your series of quests and requests from lifetime after lifetime after lifetime that have made one jaded and faded and afraid to even attempt to even get out of the covers. Any pursuit is frightening. For that person, the antidote is to have a pursuit that really ends in the discovery of yourself as that very thing that you are looking for. The discovery of the infinite, because it can only be discovered, not produced, ends in you. The search starts with you and ends in you. That's all it is. And so therefore it becomes now the shift in the pursuit from action to cognition. So therefore there is the recognition, the discovery, the knowledge. That's why the focus on the knowledge. Like I said, not that all activities and actions are dismissed. They are corralled into helping with this quest and preparing the mind to get rid of all the fears, insecurity and the tight infrastructure of doubt that one brings. To dismantle that, the first set of pursuits, the relative pursuits, are a must. But the pursuit of the absolute alone is finite. The search for the infinite. When you focus on the finite, your quest is infinite. And that's a sad little quest, that which is infinite. The quest should not be infinite. You focus on the finite, then your quest is, you focus on the infinite, your quest becomes finite, meaning it is within reach because it's not separate from you. It has to be discovered, recovered from the debris of all these raga dveshas, strong predilections, strong attachments, strong desires, strong, preponderances, all these things. It has to be rescued and recovered from this debris. And so the knowledge becomes now debris removal. And for debris removal, sometimes action is required. It's okay. But really, even while acting, I'm still focused on the knowledge. So the action subserves the knowledge, is put to use for gaining a prepared mind, for being blessed with this understanding. This is what is moksha, freedom from samsara. What is samsara? Samsara. That's what it is. And so this is what the whole thing is. And so the Kena Upanishad, another Upanishad, which does a lot of word play, very nice Upanishad. It says, Iha cheda vedit. Iha means here. Here doesn't mean in this room. Here means in this body. Iha cheda vedit. Avedit. Atha satyam asti. Then if you know in this body itself, your quest has been fulfilled. The reason for which you took a human incarnation has been fulfilled. Because the dogs and the cats do not need this knowledge. They don't have a complex centered on themselves. They are fine. The dog doesn't say, I don't like my fur. The cat doesn't say, I don't like my purr. So therefore, it doesn't need this knowledge. The human being is riddled with complexes. Because I have the free will enough to come to wrong conclusions about myself, that is why I need this knowledge. Iha cheda vedit. In this body, if one knows, atha satyam asti, that person's life is fulfilled. But of course, the other scenario also looks interesting. Na chediha vedit. If you don't know what will happen, this is what children say. If you touch this, your hand will get burned. If I don't touch this, what will happen? And so the inner child coming to this knowledge also says, so both the ways are given. Na chediha vedi. So if I don't do this, what will happen? Mahati vinashtihi. Great. It's an infinite loss. The loss of the infinite is an infinite loss, of course. But the quest of the infinite is a finite quest. So don't seek infinitely. Be the seeker of the infinite rather than the infinite seeker. This is what the Upanishad says. And so therefore, the understanding is that this life must not be wasted. In the first must. If you revel only in the corridors of the first must, it becomes a musty maze. A damp, dark, musty maze of agrahanam and anyatha grahanam. Agrahanam, not knowing my nature, anyatha grahanam, therefore coming into wrong and horrible conclusions about what I think I am. So you can't just revel in the first must. The first must lead you to the second must. And that is where the human flowering, the ultimate blossoming is there. The ultimate blossoming is really the discovery of oneself as a well of compassion, as an endless well of compassion. That is what jnanam is. That is what freedom from samsara is. That is what it is. That is what this is all leading to. Is the discovery of the compassionate heart, a heart which is not disturbed by any afflictions. It's not disturbed by affliction, directed against itself or directed against another. Even though the word compassion means to suffer with, there is no suffering here. There is only that empathizing, which if you are able to do something about it, you can, or you can pray or something. But it's not always about doing. It is about being. So that discovery that I am this oceanic compassion, not just the surface level of raging waves and foams and bubbles and tsunamis and little weather pockets. I am this deep compassion, well of compassion. That is why it's a must. And therefore, in another dialogue, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, between two sages, Yajnavalkya and who? Not Maitreyi, another story, Gargi. Gargi was the gatekeeper of this sabha. Sabha means an assembly of erudite scholars in this king's palace. It was her job to let in the gems of erudition sit in this knowledgeable assembly. So whoever would come, she would test them with questions. This is in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. But of course she met her match with Yajnavalkya. And she posed a number of questions to Yajnavalkya. And one of the questions was, who is the most stingy person on this planet? What is the definition of the stingiest person on this planet? We have an expression, kanjoos. Kanjoos means stingy. And along with that, it's also called makhi juice, means the fellow, he's so stingy that he's sitting under a tree and having his cup of tea. And curious, ill-fated fly happens to fly into the tea, its last flight. And then what does he do? Of course, he picks it out, It's the 30-second rule. What? If it's been there for less than 30 seconds, I can still have the tea. But that is sad enough that he is going to drink that whole tea. Correct? Not only that, he notices that there are a few drops of tea on this blessed fly. And he harvests. Actually, I'm putting it nicely. He actually sucks the life out of this fly. And then he continues to drink the tea. That is the stingiest person on the earth. Doesn't even want to waste that minuscule droplet on the leg of the fly. No, that's not the stingy person on the earth. That's just a little caricature. In response to her question, Sage Yagyavalkya says, Yaha Atmanam aviditva asman lokat preiti bho gargi. Oh, revered Gargi, Sahakripanaha, that is the one who is the most parsimonious, the most stingy, the one who departs from this earth without knowing oneself. What is the connection? Because this should not be the definition of one who is stingy. There is a connection because the person has hoarded the brain cells only meant for this knowledge. Hoarded the viveka, hoarded the capacity for the preparation, hoarded the cognitive abilities without even being exposed to this knowledge. What a sad sight, what a sad plight of this person. So therefore, to make the human birth successful, to be all that one can be in this life, one needs two kinds of knowledges, the relative and the absolute. And the relative is tethered to the service of the absolute, and the absolute being oneself, the relative becomes a preparation to discover and become ready to receive the knowledge of the absolute. So therefore the answer to the question, what is that one thing, is not invalid, because the second thing plays a part, first in obscuring that one thing, and second in revealing, in helping to reveal that one thing. You see, this is another paradox. So the first thing, which is nothing really, which is the knowledge of ways and means and knowledge of ends bound in time-bound ends, either if it is not known as such, if mithya is not known as such, it can conceal satyam, or if it is known as such, it is reveals satyam. It reveals the truth, it reveals you. So depending on how you use this knowledge, it has the power to conceal or it has the power to reveal. Of course, nothing conceals the Atma. The only concealing factor is you have to say as though. There is no concealing, There's just an obscuring. That's all it is. Now let us read the answer. Naisha doshaha.
Naisha doshaha.
What does that mean? This is not a dosa. No. It means there is no fallacy in this answer, Adi Shankara says. Krama apekshatvat.
Kramadekshatvat.
Prativachanasya.
Prativachanasya.
Aparahi vidya.
Aparahi vidya.
Avidyasa.
Avidyasa.
Nirakartavya.
Nirakartavya.
Yeah. Naisha doshaha. There is no problem in this, my dears. And then why? Krama apekshatvat. Apeksha means in any answer there is an expectancy of a krama. Krama means order. If supposing you ask a question to somebody, what will you have for dinner? So they say, ice cream and then soup. That doesn't make sense. They have to go from the beginning to the end. The answer has to follow a certain expectation. And then he says, that is one reason. And then he says, aparahi vidya. This apara vidya, the first knowledge that need of ways, means, ends, and how to lead life and all the outgrowing and the outgrowing that one has to do, What is outgroaning? When you outsource the groan. Yeah. So this is what it is. So all these things that one has to do is outgrowing. He says, avidya hisa. Very big proclamation by Adi Shankara. He says the first body of knowledge is just a manifestation of ignorance only. It is not knowledge, it is ultimately ignorance because it leads to dead ends. Only that knowledge which reveals the truth of you is called absolute. So this being relative, this is not going to dispel your ignorance centered on the self. Therefore it is avidya. Avidya hisa. And because it is avidya, what do you have to do? Nirakartavya. Nira plus kru. Kartavya. It has to be removed. So this avidya is removed. The first knowledge, even though it must be known, is known in order to not pursue it ultimately. Okay? It is delineated. And then he says, Tat Vishayehi Vidite Na Kinchit Tatvataha Viditam Syat Tatvataha Viditam Syad Iti. Yeah. So he says, why is it a not knowledge? Even though it's called knowledge, he is calling it ignorance. He is making the drastic step to call the first kind of knowledge actually is just a reproduction of your ignorance. Why? Because knowing which the original problem of insecurity, non-belonging, etc. is not felt. It's not, dispelled. Because, and also, tad vishayehi vidite na kinchit tatvataha viditam syat. Because if you know flower, for example, all right, come along. So, if you know this flower, what is achieved? A lot is achieved. You know how it is, you know how the stamens are, you know how the pollination takes place, you know what are the symptoms of the people who might be allergic to this flower. You know a lot. But then, but then you don't, the knowledge of this flower is not going to make you any wiser about that flower. Correct? Yeah. Then you still have to do a PhD on this flower. Yes, there are certain things in common. And then you cannot know anything completely. That is why the first kind of knowledge, the relative knowledge of all things in the universe, is called avidya, because it is a dead end. It just raises more questions than answers. It's impossible to know the universe completely. You can never say, I have conquered the knowledge of this universe. I have no vagueness, no doubt, no error. You cannot say that. That's why the scientists always are very clever. They just say working hypothesis. Big Bang, working hypothesis. Dark matter, working hypothesis. White matter, working hypothesis. Black hole, working hypothesis. How the black hole behaves, working hypothesis. And all these so-called Goldilocks planets. Goldilocks planets? Neither too hot nor too cold, just right for life. Working hypothesis. You infer that. You don't even see that. Even though Hubble is getting better eyesight all the time. But you don't see it. You just infer certain things by gravitational forces, by inferring the gravitational force, and you see that something is bouncing there, and then you can deduce the size, you can infer the mass, you can infer so many things. But again, working hypothesis meaning what? We may be wrong and we will be wrong. And so that's why we are calling it a working hypothesis. Even in medicine. Yeah. It worked on a mouse. So therefore, the chances are that you will also find your way out of this maze called life with this medicine. Brain tonic, So like this, it's all an inference. Because you cannot know. And what they knew 5 years ago, they will say, no, you must not do this. They did that with vitamin E. Before, people were popping vitamin E like candy. 10,000 IUs. Oh, no problem. Another, 3 times a day. And then, then they made a grave, literally. Discovery that suddenly the heart can stop. That which is beneficial to the heart can make it, can make it. This was a disheartening discovery, because that had to be redefined, because that knowledge is not absolute. You can never say anything absolutely. You can never, and in Eugene, you can never say it's going to be sunny today, because suddenly the clouds will gather as soon as you are saying it. That's why in this town, especially during the winter months, we chant Gayatri Mantra more and more, so that the sun will come out and help us. So this is what it is. So you can never say anything definitive, because this whole Jagat, this universe is full of non-definitive things that are finite. Each thing, and on top of that, to make matters worse, each thing resolves into another. The effect resolves into a relative cause. The relative cause becomes an effect, because it's relative. So in relation to the effect, it's cause, but in relation to another Dada cause, this becomes the effect. Dada means grandfather. Grandfather cause, not grandfather clause. Okay, so in relation to the grandfather cause, this becomes effect. In relation to that, that becomes an effect. Effect. That's why we need the causeless cause that never becomes an effect. That in effect never becomes an effect. But then this Brahman has become the Jagat? No. This Brahman has not become the Jagat. The Jagat is a projection. Without undergoing any change, Brahman projects the Jagat as it were. Just like even you project the dream, if you dream of an alligator, you don't become an alligator. And then you wake up and all the skin is scaly and that doesn't happen. It's a projection of your own memory and knowledge. That is what it is. And so too here, this is, this knowledge is called avidya, the first one. Aparavidya is called avidya. It's as good as ignorance, because no matter how much you know, you are still ignorant both of yourself and of that very thing you are trying to madly search the answers for. You are just looking in the wrong place, because what you are seeking is you. The seeker is the sought. And so, he says, the first knowledge is really avidya, because the more you know, you say, I don't know. And then he says, Nirakritya hi Purvapaksham Paschat Siddhantah Vaktavyah Bhavati Iti Nyayat. Nyayat means the logic. It is logical to assume that first the doubts are raised and then only the answer is given. Correct? First the wrong thing is mentioned, or the finite thing is mentioned, or something that needs to be dismissed, you mention that first and then dismiss it with a correct answer. So that the teacher's answer in saying two things must be known, apara and para, the relative and the absolute must be known, is correct, because only in the negation of the relative can the absolute ultimately be discovered as you, not as something outside of you. So therefore it is correct. And so what happens to the doubter who was raising the hand? He puts his hand down, sits down, impatiently waiting to ask the next question, which is going to come very soon. But meanwhile we have a delightful mantra 5. Tatra para Rigvedah Yajurvedah Samavedah Atharvavedah Shiksha Kalpah Vyakaranam Niruktam Chandah Jyotishamiti Athapara Yaya tat Aksharam Adhigamyate. Yeah. This we have already studied, this mantra. How? Because you heard the story of that's how. So let us look at the translation. Tatra means literally means there, but here it means in this context. Tatra Tatra, no, that I'm said for myself. It's that tone, when that tone comes, you immediately repeat. So I'll change the tone. I'll make a note to change the tone. So, tatra means in this context. So the apara was delineated, correct? Yeah. What was the apara? The apara is relative, it was told. Two kinds of knowledges were delineated and distinguished from one another. So now the teacher is filling in the blanks of what comes under the first category, apara, and what comes under the second category, para. So the apara list is naturally very long, because various means, various ends. If you start listing, you will be here for several lifetimes. So it's naturally long. And the para being you, it's just a one word answer there. So let us look at what he puts. So he divides a line in the middle of the page, tree bark, and he divides the line, and then what does he say? On the left hand side is apara, on the right hand side is para, because apara comes first, it has to be negated. So the apara list let us look at. He starts with a bombshell. Rig Veda, oh my God, Rig Veda is Veda? My goodness, Veda is apara knowledge of the relative? Yajur Veda. Oh, no, I'm glad I'm Samavedi. I'm not these two. Those two fellows don't know anything. These Rigveda people are, useless. My family comes from the Samaveda tradition. Samaveda. Maybe I should jump ship and become an Atharva Vedi. No, Atharva Veda. This itself is shocking. It's like a big, pumpkin dropping on the head. Very messy, because suddenly my understanding of categories, thinking that this is revealed knowledge, this is the holiest of knowledge, and this body of knowledge called the Veda is my life. What is that? Lifeboat. Something else is there. What is that? Lifeboat? What is that round thing?
Lifeline.
That round floating thing. Life vest. Yes, that life vest. To navigate through the ocean of samsara, it's going to keep me at least bobbing up and down. This Veda. Here I was wrong, because the Veda is may as well be called nada, because it is not doing anything. Zero. This Veda is a big zero. And 4 Vedas are there. Each one has so many volumes and volumes of mantras of how to do this, how to do that, what to do. 0, 0, 0. And more troubling for a Vedantin, the one who is in the Veda, and one who is in Vedanta, happens to be the not an insignificant fact that the Upanishads are inside the Veda. Ayyo, what to do now? Abhi kya kare? Rig Veda, Aitareya Upanishad, Aparavidya, non-ultimate knowledge. And then what? Yajurveda, Kathopanishad, do not study, because it's non-ultimate knowledge, relative knowledge. Samaveda, don't even touch the Chandogya Upanishad, because it is relative knowledge. And then Atharva Veda, forget this Upanishad which is coming from the Atharva Veda. When the other 3 are disregarded, this Upanishad hails from the Atharva Veda. So don't even touch it with a barge pole. Let it go right now. Then why did I study the last 4 mantras? It was another herring. Yeah, orange herring. So this is what it is. This is shocking in itself. Plus along with that are negated. Being relegated to the first knowledge, which is what? Aparavidya. What is that? Shiksha. What is shiksha? Pronunciation. Yes. Like when we say, Om Brahmavida apnoti param. How do you know? Has to go like this, and param has to go like that. Up, down, those swaras. Yeah. Shiksha Vyakhyasamaha Varnaswaraha. It consists of alphabets. Nada, Sandhanam, Samhita, where the words join, Sandhi. All these things are called Shiksha, the art of pronunciation. And how to pronounce things properly. It's a knowledge, it's a body of knowledge, very important for language, because without that you will just be saying goo, goo, ga, ga. Yes. That's how. Here we know gu plus a is gwa, as in guava. See, it is sandhi. How the words join. How the words come together. In fact, you should not say guava. No, it's guava. U plus a becomes uva. How do we know that? Because of shiksha. This is this whole thing. And then shiksha kalpaha. Next body of knowledge is called kalpa. Kalpa means the art of ritual. These liturgical details. What to do when. How to sanctify the water. How to pour the water. And how to pour the ghee into the fire. Should the ghee be offered from the left side or the right side? There are very, rules, very, very elaborate rules. And the rules are important because the rules don't stand for the rules. They have some energetic effects in sanctifying the atmosphere, in purifying the atmosphere. So therefore the rules become important. Who can do a ritual? Who is disqualified from doing a ritual? There is one ritual which says only married people should do. Agnihotra. If you're not married, don't do Agnihotra ritual. It's for married couples to do it together. A fire ritual every morning at sunrise. They sit and do. And then there are certain rituals that only people who are young should do. Like Putra Kameshti. The ritual that doing which one begets a child, a prayer, for having a child. And the Veda wants to make sure that you are not 85 when you desire a child and have a child for the sake of the child, so that the child is not left parentless. It says Krishna Kesho Yajeta. Yeah. So meaning that before the hair starts to turn grey, then only then you have to do this ritual. Even if one grey hair is there, don't do this ritual, So meaning that it's a certain age specific, certain stage specific, like married people, this is for such a person, this is for the expectant mother, this is for the father, this is for the child. All these things are given. And the art of all this, these liturgical acts designed for prayer, acts of prayer either for oneself or on behalf of others. There are very strict and elaborate rules called kalpa. Kalpa is the know-how of rituals. And then we have what? Chandas. What is chandas? Chandas means meter. Meter. Yes. And what is the meter? Gayatri is a meter. 24 syllables. Shardula Vikriditam. The tiger at play is a meter. The baby tiger at play. When the sensitive heard it, they could see in the way the verse was composed, it mimicked the play of the baby tiger. Vishvandarpana Drishyamana Nagari Tulyan Nijantargatam Pashyannatmani Mayaya Bahiribodh Bhutayatha Nidraya Yasakshat Kurute Prabodha Samaye Swatmanamevadvayam Tasmai Shri Guru Murtaye Namaidam Shri Dakshina Murtaye. In this, if you notice carefully, you see the catch and release of the baby tiger playing with its prey. We hope it's not our foot or some body part, but if it's some other prey, we can appreciate that. When the baby tiger plays, and any kind of cat, big or small, it's not going to catch and then eat. No. Catch, release, give it a thwack, and then watch. Oh, it's moving again. How exciting. Go there and give it, and then, do this little thing they do. They sit and kind of do this, and then jump on this poor, unsuspecting prey. They also pray, see? Yeah, P-R-E-Y. And then they jump on it, give it another whack, and then they let it go. In fact, they let it run for a bit. And in this verse, you can see that. You can see the withdrawal and the approach. That is why it's called Shardula Vikriditam. Then we have our catch-all meter. What is it called? Anushtup. What is this Anushtup? Anushtup. Dharma kshetre kurukshetre samavetaayuyutsavah mamakav pandavaschaiva kimakurvata sanjaya. Where is this from? Which Upanishad? Bhagavad Gita. The tune itself gives it away. It's a typical Gita tune. But we can confuse also. We can confuse the people by chanting the same Anushtup in a different tune. Yeah. We can do that. Like for example, you can say, if you take another verse in the Anushtup meter, like what was it? Kataksha kirana chantanaman mohabdhaye namaha amrita nanda krishnaya jagan mangala murtaye. Same 16 syllable meter, but chanted in a different tune. And then, the people keep wondering, which meter? Then there is a meter of 12 syllables called Trishtup, which also the Gita employs and the Upanishad employs. In fact, some of these are in Trishtup. Om Brahma Devanam Prathamas Sambhabhuva. This is Trishtup. Gita also says that. Apuryamanam achala pratishtham. Like this, Trishtup is there. And so therefore there are all these, the knowledge of the meter, because even in English we have that iambic, dactyl, you have that that crescent moon, which is a non-accented things only can occupy that space. And then you have that long one where only accented things, syllables can occupy that space. And then you have to have the know-how of putting these together to produce these various meters for the mantras. That is called Chandas. Is it Paravidya or Aparavidya? Apara. And then we have the first Sanskrit dictionary of synonyms and antonyms called Niruktam, written by the sage Yaska. Niruktam is the first Sanskrit thesaurus. So Niruktam means words and their meanings. Is it para or apara? Apara. And then we have Jyotisham. Jyotisham is right in the middle of astronomy and astrology. It's both and it's neither. It's actually a mixture of both, in a way. And we never do anything without looking up at the sky to see the planetary configuration on a particular day, at a particular time, even for studies. The first day after the full moon or the new moon is no study. The full moon or the new moon also is no study, because that is when the mind gets affected. It does. It does. It's not conducive for study. And the 8th day is not conducive for study. So you see, after 7 days, you get 1 day holiday, and every other weekend is a long weekend. Fantastic way to study. Very nice. And so there is time to study, and for marriage also, certain kind of stars, if they are there, then the bride and groom who are starring in the marriage will just be seeing stars, because it's a combative muhurtam. Muhurtam means that time. Sometimes you get, you have to avoid those kinds for marriages. Because if you get married at a combative time, you'll be fighting the rest of your life. This is not good. And same thing, to do something, which is bringing in money, you don't do it at certain times. Like starting a business and starting some venture capitalism, whatever it is. You don't do it at certain times because there is a kshaya, the muhurta shows decline. Yes. So you wait for those, and whether it's a transitory planets or the transitory planets in your own birth chart, you wait for those correct moments to start your life, and that itself is a big know-how. It's called Jyotisha. That's why anybody can go without a job in India, but the astrologer will always be paid, happily paid. Because even the person who says, I don't believe in God, will go to the astrologer. This is what it is. Very interesting. And here everyone, regardless of their religion, the Christian goes to the astrologer, the Islamic person goes to the astrologer, the Buddhist goes to everybody goes to the astrologer. Very interesting. So this is Jyotisham. And then, what else? What was the next one? Vyakaranam. How could I forget Vyakaranam? Vyakaranam is what you do on Wednesdays. And what is it that you do on Monday also? What is it that you do Monday, Wednesday? Sanskrit grammar or any grammar. Grammar is Vyakaranam. And this Vyakaranam is important because it helps you to have this language and the structure. Otherwise you will be not talking properly. You will say is when you are supposed to say Ishvara, and so you will say was when you are supposed to say is. So the agreement between sentence, gender, number, all these things, verb, noun, all these things have to agree. Those agreements have to be understood. And then if you don't know tenses, you become tense. So you have to know tenses, you have to know moods. Without getting into a bad mood, you have to know all these things. So this is grammar. And then, is this Aparavidya or Paravidya? Apara. And then, is that the end? What else is left? Iti. What branch of knowledge is Iti? Huh? Yeah. Iti means thus. Meaning that's the end. That's the end of the list of Apara, and by extrapolation we have to include other Upavedas like archery, the knowledge of what? The knowledge of the weaponry, the knowledge of Ayurveda, the knowledge of cooking, everything you have to, all the Vedas that are there, everything. Veda means knowledge. Anything that's connected to the Veda even remotely is talked about, is included in this list. Now I have a question. So what is left out? Nothing is left out. Yeah, but what is left out to fill in the other blank of Paravidya column? What shall we fill it with? There is nothing left to fill. In fact, all the bodies of knowledge have been just relegated, have occupied Apara. In fact, we can start a new movement, Occupy Apara. They have occupied Apara. What will occupy Para? There is nothing there to occupy Para. And he just puts one line in that column. Yaya. What is Para? Yaya, by which Aksharam, that indeclinable, that changeless you, is revealed. Yaya means by whatever happens in the mind, not by the mind, in the mind, when the knowledge is delivered. Because the knowledge is delivered, is transmitted, and then a very important part of the transmission is the receiving. So the process of receiving, in the receiving, that cognition, or rather that recognition that takes place, and the invisible processes of dropping the ignorance, even in the class situation, when the ignorance is dropped and that aha moment takes place, neither the moment is para, nor the aha is para, but what is understood by that, What you can say, I can understand, but not repeat or not give voice to, because the teaching just points to it. And what it points to, which is understood by you as the truth of yourself, that alone is para. Everything else is apara. But how? We'll see that next week. So next important announcement, next week we are having Saturday this class, correct? Yeah. And then Sunday what are we having? That Vedanta Dindima, which meets once a month. Because of my travel schedule we are preponing it. So that's at 9:30 to noon in the morning on Sunday. Which date it is? Does anybody have the numbers? Date? 30th. So 29th we will see why this is called Para knowledge, what is Para knowledge, and we will read the long bhashya connected to it, a long commentary, what Adi Shankara says, etc. And on Sunday everybody gets to sleep in, because we don't have to wake up dark and early, and we can come at 9:30 and do that once a month class. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hari Om. Any questions are there?
So when you include Upanishads in Gita and all that in Apara, the understanding is that when you get the knowledge, all these are just words to be discarded.
Yeah, but even before you get the knowledge, they are the words.
Yes.
But it's not the words that make the knowledge, it's what is conveyed by them, and not even what is conveyed by them, what you understand as yourself when the words convey. So the words only convey. They are like the conveyor belt, but what you are riding on that conveyor belt. So it kind of, imagine a few brushes on the conveyor belt that divests you of all the ragas, the dveshas, the things that should not be there. And that and what is understood and taken in by you, and when you see what is delivered, so the words have basically committed suicide, meaning they are no longer needed. That's why we can say yato vacho nivartante, where the words go, and be it a retreat along with its friend the mind, they come hand in hand with their head hung, because they are not able to describe this as an object. So this which is para is not an object. If it's not the object, what is it? The truth of you, the subject. The words can, by lakshanaya, by indirect ways, show you or lead you, give you some words or some indication of what it is. But since it's non-separate from you, it is not mystical. It is understood as you. There's nothing mystical about it. That is how the teaching works. It's not that you have to sit and intuit yourself. You cannot. We are trying to find the nature of the intuitor. You cannot stumble upon yourself, because we are trying to understand the content, the truth of the stumbler. And so therefore, the words have a very special place in the knowledge. The words deliver, but indirectly. And that you is already self-revealing. Because when I ask the question, are you here? You have to invariably say, yes, I am here. That presence which advertises itself, which is known, which you want to be, which you already are, which you are seeking, which is the sought. The words basically help you to handshake yourself. Shake hands with yourself. They just point to you. This is the person you have to get to know. This is the person you have to shake hands with. Look, you're right here. And you say, oh, it's like having the glasses on the head, You look everywhere, and somebody says, right there, Or you look in the mirror and you laugh. And so here the Upanishad, words of the Upanishad becomes the mirror. So the mirror doesn't give you knowledge. The mirror helps you see. The mirror is an aid. So the words are an indirect aid that bring you in connection to yourself, and in the process, because you could not see the hand to shake yourself, So you were shaking everything else and you were shaken because you were not able to see that. But here it dispels the ignorance in the form of the stranglehold of desires, fears and insecurities so that you are able to see what to shake. And you are unshaken in the process. You come out unshaken. And so this is that is why it comes under apara. It is relative because they just indicate that which cannot be captured by the word, which need not be captured by the word because it's not. That's why I said it's not mysterious. It need not be captured by the word because it's advertising itself. It's you who is present, who says I am, that I am never shuts up. And so what I am, don't ask the next question. That is what is clarified. And so that's why the words have a special thing. Yes, exactly like Parthaya Pratibodhitam. That is also in Trishtup. Very good. Yeah. Yes.
The definition of compassion for a jiva is to suffer with, as you said.
No. I said even though that is how it is understood, it's not correct.
Oh, could
Yeah.
you explain that further?
Because if you suffer with someone, then how are you able to, then that means two people are suffering here. Yeah. That suffer doesn't mean actually suffer. Suffer, see, it's very simple. If supposing somebody comes to you and say, I'm having a very hard time and I've had difficulties, my health is terrible and my life is terrible, the spouse is terrible, the house is leaking, house is terrible, everything is terrible. And then you say, oh my God, I suddenly don't feel very well after listening to your story, then you are not able to help them in any way. You see? Compassion means being in the place of the Sakshi, being yourself in that place of neutrality, where somebody else's distress doesn't immediately invoke yours. Because that is the only reason to feel sad. Because even though we say, I'm feeling sad for you, but really speaking, your own pain is being evoked. Either a real pain or a real trauma that happened a long time ago, or a hypothetical pain of thinking what will happen if I am in your shoes, oh my God. I don't even want to think about it. Your life sounds horrible. Keep it to yourself. But, I will cry when I look at your life because I worry that that may be my fate. This is not compassion, really. That doesn't mean that the compassionate person may not cry. That's not the issue here. The issue is that identifying with somebody else's pain and distress neither helps them nor helps you. That is passion. That is not compassion. Yeah. Compassion is a sense of resonance where you are able to see their helplessness. You are able to empathize with it without judgment, without fear, without being afflicted yourself. You are able to see where they come from. And you are able to grant them full freedom to be exactly where they are without expecting something better out of them or without what you think is better. Without expecting them to be somewhere where you think they should be. That's compassion. Sometimes it is allowing them to be where they are and helping them learn their own lessons, which is a very invaluable part of a person's growth. Compassion doesn't mean going and rescuing, because that need to rescue others outside, always, feeling like I'm in a helicopter throwing out some rope to somebody else. That need to rescue comes from an uninterrogated, helpless part of oneself that is seeking this, rescual, this rescuing. So that is what has to be addressed. Sometimes, that is what it is. Sometimes this activism also. Many people, especially when one is in the teens and the 20s, becomes an activist because one wants to fix something which it's all about fixing within. And that's okay, there's nothing wrong. Because like I said, it's an apara activity that helps you to see what is needing to be fixed is right here. Because the universe is how it is. It is finite and it is full of, it can never be exactly how everyone wants it to be. Because even if you say, I have the correct temperature, I have the correct, season, let it be always be spring. And by magic wand you wave, and it's always 71 degrees and spring, and sun is shining. And then what will happen? You'll have people who have allergies who will start throwing stones at you because they'll be permanently unhappy. Yeah, because everyone cannot be happy. Because everybody is coming with their, like I said, their own infrastructure. But if you are not touched by that in the sense of you're resonating with that without being afflicted by other people's anger, sorrow, etc., you're not practicing in their transference. You're sitting quietly with yourself. In fact, the solutions that come from that place of quietude are really deeper, And we have seen, I've told you this story of that, Vietnamese monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, who lives in France, and he wrote in one book that one man who had lost his family in a fire came and stayed at his ashram. I shared that story with you. And what did he do? That man would not come out of his place. He was given a cottage, and the master said, take as much time as you want to grieve. What are you doing? He says, I'm a journalist and photographer, and I know how to do all these things, websites. And he says, well, the publication department really needs you. Please come and help. You can stay here, but come and help. 3 months go by, 6 months go by, 9 months go by. All the time he's wailing and sitting and not coming from under the covers, never emerging from there, except, once in a while. He's not coming out at all, not coming out of this grief, not just out of the room. So one day he's given the message, the master is coming to see you. He had already been given many warnings that he has to start at least participating in the life of the ashram, or in his own life actually. And then what? He doesn't do that. And then the master says, do you have a match? And then sets fire to his cottage right in front of him. That was a very compassionate act. And of course, imagine, already he has such a bad association with fire, and the master reproduces it so that he will come out of it. That is what it is. And we hear stories like this. A war vet, I think a Vietnam war vet, an indigenous man, I forget from which tribe, comes home, comes back to the tribe, and he is such a dead weight because he's, lost one leg and one hand or something, and he's crying all the time, bringing the whole tribe down, he's not participating in the life. Of course, people in the beginning took flowers, took food, went shopping for him, did everything, but it became very clear that he was just throwing this web of helplessness on people and not doing anything to help himself. So they had a meeting, without him of course, and they said compassionately, what is the best thing for him right now to do? And they came and said, they were very honest about it. We have had a meeting, and we have come to the conclusion that there is only one remedy, and we can't tell you that right now because its efficacy will be gone if we tell you the ingredients of this remedy. He says, anything, I want to get well. He did, but he just said that, I'm so helpless. And sometimes people do that. I have a chronic disease, nothing will help. If I take this, that happens. If I take this, nothing else. So that somebody will always keep on giving them medicine. So he also was like that, attached to the illness as a way of life. And so the tribe decided, and they said, okay, tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning, this is what is going to happen. So he was carried around the village or whatever that reservation was, and he felt very good. He was garlanded, he was given all these, and prayer was done on him, and they prayed for him, and they did a cleansing with feathers and everything. And then this part, then they tied him up, the one leg and hand that was remaining, and attached a weight for good measure, and they chanted a mantra and threw him in the lake, in a deep lake. And they stood on the other side, patiently waited and prayed. Glub, 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 all silence. Oh, panic, panic, but still they were praying. Inside panic, but outside they were just so sure that this is the only way. And then glub, 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 thrash, 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 the fellow takes off the fetters literally and figuratively, swims to the shore where they are waiting with towels, garlands, and they hold him, they embrace him, he cries, he just lets go of all this. That was a compassionate act. That was a very compassionate act, a collectively compassionate act. So compassion doesn't mean, oh, you coddle the person, you coddle the pattern, you just keep making a mummy out of them. It's not mummifying them, protecting them. Sometimes you have to do this. So compassion doesn't mean always suffering with. You see what is to the benefit of that person. And that you can only be in that place when you have nothing to benefit from them. That's why you have to get to that place of needing nothing from that person or from any person who comes to you, either internally or externally. And you can only get to that place when you understand that everything is Bhagavan and you are being taken care of Bhagavan, by Ishvara, by God. And only the person who lives with that kind of an abandon qualifies for that compassion. That is why the letting go, the apara has to be let go. Before that para, that compassion comes. It's a process of discovery. That compassion is there. It doesn't come and go. It is there. It is discovered. You discover compassion through deliberate acts of compassion. And I'm going to talk about it a lot next week. Because usually in this culture, the feeling is, if I don't have it, I can't give it. I don't have money, therefore don't ask me, I can't give. I was not loved as a child, so I can't love someone else. This is a wrong premise. A premise of coming from the capitalist wrong understanding of ownership of resources. But compassion is not that. It already is there in great measure. It has to be discovered by participating in deliberate acts of compassion where you reach out. Even, if it's a stretch and then the muscle is sore and then you put some liniment on it, okay, no problem. Compassion is a muscle. If you don't exercise it, it atrophies. And I'll be talking about that at length next time. Any other question? Okay.